also now time for the EU to grow up and try to become a serious player, or else be sidelined and, in fact, made irrelevant. So it is an existential time for the European Union. I talk about the EU's armed forces rather than an army because there it's in plural, and we might think of a constellation of forces that can be at the disposal of the European Union. This situation, Russia's war against Ukraine, is in fact a very serious challenge to the European political order. And the EU, for the first time, also has a defense commissioner in the European Commission. That we will likely see a much more significant push towards integration of defense resources in Europe, in the EU, in the coming months and years. Or other tech giants, they've been very much playing their own game around the world. The only region where they actually cannot really, play out their own game, it's actually the EU because of the regulatory capacity. The constraints of the EU's structure or the nature of the EU actually allow it to do things which states actually cannot do. When the negotiation was happening, Viktor Orban was asked to go for a coffee, leave the room, and have a coffee outside, so that the other 26 member states could actually then agree to this sanctions package, and he agreed to do this. The interesting point about the EU is that, in fact, it is not a state. If it became a federal state, it would be an extremely boring development. So what's interesting about the European External Action Service is that it is actually not just a foreign ministry. So it's operating as a kind of I call it an interstitial organization. So an organization operating across multiple institutional domains, combining diplomacy, defense, intelligence, development aid, and trade support. The European Union has about 140 delegations around the world. Like France has about 200, more than 200 actually. Even for these major European powers, like France and Germany, still the European Union's delegation and the EU's approach to diplomacy is sometimes beneficial to have because they do not have the colonial legacies. The EU's diplomatic status has been subject to all kinds of pressures and all kinds of questioning. So it has had to struggle in its attempts to establish its diplomatic status. Is that French language is very much spoken throughout the External Action Service. Of course, it's English, absolutely. I mean, English works as the lingua franca. Everyone, uses that. But then French is actually the second one, which everyone has to speak on a very high level or a working level. So these underrepresented groups, females, Central and Eastern Europeans, can actually make a major impact. And that there are not many lobbying rules. So, it's far from that regulated as it is in the United States. So in many respects, when we think about the defense industrial complex in the EU and defense production in the EU, we need to think about the UK as part of this. There are actually hundreds. We have in our database currently 564 such private military and security companies that operate out of the member states of the European Union, or in fact, some of them are based outside the EU, but they have contracts with the EU.
Today I have a very prominent guest, Dr. Jozef Bátora. He is a professor of international relations at Webster Vienna Private University in Vienna, and also Department of Political Science at Comenius University in Bratislava. He was a visiting professor at Stanford and some other places as well. So welcome, Dr. Bátora. It's great to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alisher. It's great to see you, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Oh, thank you. It's a great honor for me. Dr. Bátora is known for his approach to international relations and diplomacy from organizational theory standpoint. And he is also an expert in European politics, European diplomacy. So if you don't mind, we would concentrate today on European diplomacy.
Sure.
Let me start from the question how European diplomacy is coping with today's global challenges.
Now, it is obvious that this is really a challenging time when we, of course, are experiencing, various kinds of change dynamics. Part of it is the return of geopolitics to world politics, and of course also of conventional warfare to Europe, if we are to look at this from the European perspective. With the Russian attack on Ukraine, we have seen a major challenge to the European order, to the European political order, and also to what we could call the liberal international order. So, of course, there we have a major set of challenges, and so how is European diplomacy coping with it? Well, it is, of course, and I guess we will discuss it throughout this conversation and various aspects of that. But I would say it is a process of, both experimentation and development of new forms of diplomatic approaches, new kinds of diplomatic approaches. This is what the European Union has been doing for a long time. But you might say it is also now time for the EU to grow up and try to become a serious player, or else be sidelined and, in fact, made irrelevant. So it is an existential time for the European Union.
How do you assess current dynamics of American-European relations?
Now, again, this is one of those things that have been a constant, that have been relatively stable for the last in recent decades. And of course, we have seen, the U.S. has been a very supportive player in terms of European integration since the very early days of, the founding days of European communities and later on the European Union. This approach, or this supportive approach of the United States, is now going through a period of uncertainty, I would say, especially because of the current U.S. administration's approach, which I would call transactional, which is very much looking at, what's in it for us, and how do we really promote our interests in the best way. And there, of course, the Europeans, the EU, and and its member states have not always been up to the game, and up to their own game, actually, because they've been very reliant on the United States in their security and also in their overall weight in global affairs. So I think it is a period of trying to redefine and define the role of the United States in relation to Europe again, and also to define and redefine the role of the European Union in relation to the United States. And it's, of course, a question, again, a kind of an existential question: to what extent is the European Union ready to and ready to really take on a serious role as a geopolitical actor? It is not a given that it will do so, but of course, unless it does so, it probably becomes irrelevant.
Oh, interesting. So, do you expect that the EU will eventually create its own army?
Yeah, so this discussion has been going on for a while now, not for a while, but actually for decades. Since the 1950s, we have had these, proposals on the table back and forth in terms of, the EU should be or shouldn't it be creating an army. Now, obviously, the European Union is not a state, and although some might compare it to a federal state, it is not a state, and so. For it to have an army, actual armed forces like a state, that is not a likely scenario, because, of course, this is a group of states and a community of states that work together. But it's, of course, more than an international organization as well. So we will see to what extent there will be a way of moving forward with this idea of European armed forces. I talk about the EU's armed forces rather than an army because there it's in plural, and we might think of a constellation of forces that can be at the disposal of the European Union. The EU has had its own battle groups concept that has been developed, that have been training together. They have not been deployed, though, because there hasn't really been political will to deploy these forces. But I think if the EU is to be a significant or a serious geopolitical player, it will have to strengthen its ability to deploy military force in a serious manner, and that, of course, is only possible if we create some kind of new organizational platform for this.
Right.
So we need to. I think we are in a period of trying to define how this could happen and whether it will happen again. But this time again, it is a serious situation, as serious as it gets, actually, because I mean there is a realization in the European capitals, not just in Brussels, but also in all member states, most of the member states, that in fact this situation, Russia's war against Ukraine, is in fact a very serious challenge to the European political order. And in fact, not maybe just to Ukraine, but in fact, as I said, broadly to the European political order, to the very foundations of European integration. And so the mindset is setting in that, in fact, defense has to be prioritized. In fact, even smaller countries like Denmark, for instance, smaller member states, have just radically increased their defense budgets. Denmark just last week has increased its budget by 70%. So it's extreme. There is a real clear realization. The UK is going to have be using 2.5% of its GDP on defense. Poland, they've had about 4.5% of their GDP on defense for a while now. Of course, the Baltic states as well. And so there is much more attention to this. And the EU, for the first time, also has a defense commissioner in the European Commission. And there, of course, this is about coordinating defense industries in a much more serious way than it was the case until now. And so as soon as this gets into the domain of the European Commission, that's also an area which hasn't really been covered by the European Commission so far. Defense has been an exclusive realm of the member states. So now that it becomes a domain which is coordinated by the European Commission, that's also something that then becomes a very prominent area of European integration. And that means that we will likely see a much more significant push towards integration of defense resources in Europe, in the EU, in the coming months and years.
Do you think United States will support strengthening of European armed forces?
Well, from for successive U.S. administrations, going back to George W. Bush, and then later on Barack Obama, and of course Joe Biden as well. Successive administrations have been raising the issue with European allies that they should be increasing their defense, investments and defense expenditures. And this has been an issue that the U.S. has tried to, bring forward to the Europeans and explain that this is really necessary for them to actually take more responsibility and at least be able to deploy in the neighborhood of the European Union militarily, right? To take on a little bit more of military responsibility here. And so the current push by the Trump administration to, for the Europeans to do this, asking them to take more responsibility, invest more, spend more on defense, I think it's just part of this broader tendency for the last 20 years or so, where the U.S. administrations have tried to ask Europeans to be more active. So I think, in fact, that this is going to be supported by the United States. This is something the United States have been asking for a long time. So I don't see any problems there. Obviously, what is really important, obviously, is so that platforms are found that enable the EU and NATO to cooperate. There are already institutionalized frameworks for this, for information sharing, but also for coordination. Whenever the EU deploys into crisis management missions, it is very much using NATO and/or US infrastructure, communications, and so on. So in many respects, this is already well in place. So the frameworks for it are there, and I don't see any reasons why the United States shouldn't support more fundamental EU defense.
There are clear some differences between United States and Europe on quite a few issues, such as environment, internet regulation, and AI and some others. What will happen with these differences?
Well, there I think the European Union has been very clear and very adamant in terms of pointing out that EU regulations have to apply to some of the tech giants as well. Apple, Tesla, or other tech giants. They've been very much playing their own game around the world. The only region where they actually cannot really, you know, play out their own game, it's actually the EU because of the regulatory capacity that the European Commission has in this area. And so I think this regulatory capacity, I mean, the European Union is, after all, a market of about 450 million people. And so they really are interested in accessing this market. These are really, well-to-do economies. So they are doing, this is really, the tech giants are interested in being present here and actively using these customers. So I think there the EU actually has a lot of leverage here in terms of regulatory capacity, and even these tech giants such as Meta and others have been very careful not to alienate the EU. So negotiations will likely go on, but I don't see the EU backing down from its standards of how information privacy and so on. This is all going to be implemented, and this is again one of those areas in which the EU actually is a very powerful player.
Let's speak about some global conflicts. So how do you assess the effectiveness of European diplomacy in the context of Russian war on Ukraine and Middle East crisis?
Well, I would say that, again, when we're looking at the European Union as a diplomatic actor, we should be looking at it as a diplomatic actor, which is not exactly your standard state type actor. And that also tells us then at least two aspects which are important when you're assessing how the EU actually acts. One is, what is it capable of doing? What is it can do? And how is it doing it, right? So let's think about the first aspect here. What is it doing? Now, because the European Union is not a state, because in diplomacy, as you know very well, and you've written about it, in diplomacy, you normally do not get involved in internal affairs of your counterparts.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, this has been actually the way the European Union has been acting as a modus operandi. They have been involved in the internal affairs of other countries, and be that in support of transformation efforts in the neighborhood, in the processes of enlargement of the European Union. That has been actually very much built on the idea of involvement in internal affairs, in supporting various kinds of transformation processes towards democratization, towards liberalizing the trade, and so on and so forth. And so in this case, the European Union has actually had a set of instruments that it uses, and that those go well beyond your traditional diplomatic toolbox. Those go in the direction of supporting societal transformations, civil society support, as well as supporting economic transformations. And so there, if you look at the EU's engagement in the current crisis, in the current war in Ukraine, the EU has actually been very instrumental in supporting Ukraine as a state, but not just, because of course it's often criticized, the EU is often criticized that, militarily it is very limited in terms of what it can provide. But obviously, Ukrainian ability to defend itself as a state doesn't just depend on the forces on the battlefield. It very much depends on the societal resilience and on the ability of the society to withstand such a large and massive attack by a very powerful armed forces of a neighboring country. So in this case, the EU actually plays a very important role in this broader societal support and resilience of Ukraine. It's been providing a lot of aid, so funding and financial aid, obviously, but also support of governance and the economy, as well as support to various sectors in the society to build up their capacity and to build up their strength and the ability to be resilient. So in that sense, the EU's approach is actually, a broader type of diplomatic engagement, which has all these different aspects. So that's one thing. What is it the EU can do? And it can do it because it's not a state. That's kind of paradoxical. The constraints of the EU's structure or the nature of the EU actually allow it to do things which states actually cannot do. So that's one point. And the other point is, how does the EU then act? How does it make its decisions in these situations? Now, you see there that, of course, decisions in external relations of the European Union, in the EU's common foreign and security policy, those are consensual. They're based on consensus. And even though some member states of the European Union, most notably Hungary, more recently Slovakia, have been critical of the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, still the EU has been able to agree to as many as, I think it's now 14th package of sanctions against Russia. That's a tough one. I mean, that's not an easy thing to achieve. And of course, once there are all kinds of negotiations going on about these sanctions packages, but in the end, the EU always manages to agree. And that's quite something in terms of how it goes forward. And in fact, there are some interesting rules as to how, or interesting procedures, interesting practices, diplomatic practices actually, in the negotiations of these sanctions packages. So, for instance, in December 2023, Hungary and their Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, they've been very clear that they're not going to support a sanctions package of about 50 billion euros that was going to be, agreed to at the December summit of the European Council. That's the summit of the prime ministers of the European Union. Now, he was clear when he arrived to the meeting that he's not going to support this and he's going to block the sanctions package. Now, eventually, he got invited to a smaller meeting before the main session. This was a smaller meeting with the prime ministers of France, with the prime minister of Germany, the German chancellor, the French president, as well as the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. They had a conversation, sort of a private conversation, where they discussed the repercussions of this situation. I'm not sure, we're not privy to the nature of the conversation, but still it was there. And then eventually, when the negotiation was happening, Viktor Orbán was asked to go for a coffee, leave the room, and have a coffee outside, so that the other 26 member states could actually then agree to this sanctions package. And he agreed to do this, right? And he left the room, and so this is interesting. It's interesting to have these kinds of, let's call it, gag rules in diplomacy, which allow for it's what you could also call constructive abstention. So it's interesting to that these compromises that lead to maintenance of unity in light of these challenges are achieved. So even though there's a lot of criticism of the EU in terms of its actorness and that it's cumbersome, it's actually striking how unified the European Union has been in relation to such very difficult decisions as sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, very interesting. We see that European Union acts as a single unitary actor in trade negotiation. They have a single team. So, but it's not the case in political issues, as you just mentioned as well. So if tomorrow very top European leadership would invite you and ask, Dr. Bátora, would you advise us to act as a single political actor? What would you say? Yes, or well, let's keep some differences in the position of European countries.
So obviously, it's the very simple answer would be yes, the EU should be unified, but that's not how it could happen, and I wouldn't answer that, because the interesting point about the EU is that in fact it is not a state, because as we talked about before, it not being a state, rather a community of states connected by institutions or regulated by institutions, that allows it to do things which it otherwise cannot do. So in terms of action capacity, it is actually capable of the European Union is capable of doing things that states normally cannot do. So if it became a state, if it would become unified as a state, it would lose this capacity of doing these, let's call it combined or new types of things, new kinds of approaches to its external relations. At the same time, I would, I sometimes say that to also to students, and that when we think about the European Union in its development, if it became a federal state, it would be an extremely boring development, because obviously they would just be copying an established model. This would not be new
big
at all.
state.
Just a big state, but just another state, right? And we know what it means. It would be boring and dangerous, because we know what happens when, on the one hand, conceptually it would be boring because we would not be developing anything new, and then at the same time it would be dangerous because we know what happens when federations are created, or when big states are created. We have seen that in the Italian experience, the unification of Italy. We have seen that in the case of unification of Germany. So it's not an easy decision to make, and I'm not sure if it actually would be a wise decision either. So I think the exciting thing about the European Union is that it acts the way it acts, and that it doesn't become a state and can operate as a network of states that are connected and working together.
Yeah, very interesting. I see a paradox. Maybe you agree or not. On the one hand, European Union is a really big actor in providing foreign assistance, humanitarian assistance, helping many developing countries. But on the other hand, most people don't see a European Union as an actor, kind of. Maybe part of the problem or part of the issue is related to the image of European Union. So it's not just acting as a unitary actor together, but creating image. I don't know, would you agree to consider that the image is one of the biggest issue in terms of perception of European Union as a single actor?
Indeed. I mean, of course, the image problem of the European Union has been studied a lot and analyzed a lot, as you also point out. The problem with that is, of course, that its image problem, if we want to call it that, is related to the fact that it's not a standard actor. It's not a state, but it's not a typical international organization either. It's a kind of a hybrid organization. Yeah. Very exciting to study, very interesting, but at the same time difficult to comprehend for your usual citizens. Not easy to explain either. I mean, you need to study its institutional setup and so on, the way it operates. So people have difficulties in actually understanding how the European Union operates, what it is, and so it's easily then labeled as something that it actually isn't, and so it has what you could call an image problem. There is a quote I read of from a Middle Eastern diplomat at some point. This is maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Essentially, he said that the United States give you offers that you cannot refuse. The European Union gives you offers that you cannot understand. And so that's one of those things which also kind of show or indicate that, in fact, the European Union is institutionally a comprehensive and difficult actor to understand. And so, yes, the image problem the EU has to do primarily with that, with the lack of understanding of how it operates and what it does. So yeah, I think it's a question of public outreach. It's a question of how the EU actually talks about itself, what kind of narratives it can spread about its own work, and how it can reach those who are supported by its funding, because there is actually a lot of funding provided. The EU is one of the largest aid donors worldwide, so it is very active, but still, actually suffering from a major image problem. Yes, that's true.
I heard that I don't remember who said, but there is one of the most effective way to overcome this image issue is creating a European football club.
Oh yes, indeed. I mean, and there are actually quite a few very good clubs in Europe.
When you think not a separate countries club, but European Union club.
Oh yes, and that would be interesting. And obviously, if you went down that road, if we ended up having a football championship and you would use the EU club, I think they would be hard to beat in world football.
Right. You just mentioned European Union institutions in the institutional framework. From organizational perspective, so if again you would be asked, Dr. Bátora, please give us some advice how to improve our organizational effectiveness, what would you say?
Well, I think one of the issues there is, in fact, the European Union's administration is, I mean, it's considerably large, but it is not larger than that of the City of London. So it's not actually all that large. I mean, it's not a huge bureaucracy. It is it's a big bureaucracy, but still not, not bigger than the public sector in London. So in a way, it's of course what it is suffering off, I think. Mostly is the problem of overlapping competencies, overlapping ideas as to who's doing what at some point. But I mean, it's also a problem of the policy making and the development of policies on the EU level ends up creating some serious democratic deficits in countries. Because of course these policies often are proposed by the European Commission, that then they are negotiated in the Council of the European Union by ministers from governments of the member states, but they're not necessarily directly then those who propose this legislation are not necessarily directly democratically accountable to those upon whom these decisions have then direct impact, that is the citizens in the member states. And so there are ways of how, of course, this could be improved, these democratic deficits. There's an entire literature discussing various ways of how, policymaking could become more responsive, how deliberative democracy could help, and so on and so forth. But of course, we have democratic processes also inside the member states, in which you also have decision-making and discussions, debates in parliaments. It works better in some countries and not so good in other countries of the other member states of the European Union. So there are multiple levels, if you were to ask me, where this could be improved. But I don't think we have any one single model for how this could be improved. Very often one tends to think about, let's say, a federal bureaucracy model, that this somehow should be the way forward. But that again would be very much a state-centric way of thinking about the EU, and I wouldn't really go down that road, because that would simply be, again, something that could be kind of boring and kind of dangerous if you're making the EU into a federal state. The question, of course, is if the EU will not be forced to go down that road now that it is facing very dire circumstances in global affairs and some serious threats to its own existence.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should not forget that bureaucracy is a very important part of modern diplomacy. When we consider diplomatic effectiveness, of course, we should consider also bureaucracy. How does it work?
If you compare, for instance, the sizes of foreign services, the US, I think they have about, is it 15 or 20,000 diplomats? I can't remember the number now, but I think it's something like that in their foreign service, who are deployed around the world and also working in Washington, D.C. But the European Union is at about 4,000 to 5,000. So it's not, it's again not a huge bureaucracy.
Okay. So you're talking about the size of European diplomacy, but not whole European bureaucracy.
No,
that's
absolutely.
another issue. So
that's a different issue.
All right. So let's talk about the European External Action Service, which is indeed the European Diplomatic Service. So how do you assess its effectiveness now? Is it a real good diplomatic service, or it's just developing its capacity?
So what's interesting about the European External Action Service is that it is actually not just a foreign ministry. I mean, it would, we often tend to think of it, if we call it a diplomatic service, we often immediately automatically think of it as a foreign service. as a foreign ministry, but that's actually not just that. I mean, it is more than that, because it's also got elements that would remind you of a defense ministry, of an intelligence agency, as well as a trade and development support agency. So there are multiple functions that the European External Action Service actually fulfills. Again, as you know, when the European External Action Service was founded, this was a kind of a compromise, an institutional compromise, as well as a legal compromise, because originally in the Lisbon Treaty, in the constitutional proposal, constitutional treaty proposal, 2002, 2003, we had seen a different kind of setup that was suggested. This was to be a federal foreign ministry of the European Union. It was going to have a federal foreign minister, federal foreign service, more or less, EU level, right? Federal type of structures. So almost like copying a federal state model. But that didn't happen. This was, of course, not agreed to. And so the External Action Service of the European Union was agreed as a kind of an institutional compromise. But because of the constraints, in fact, it can actually do what federal foreign services cannot do. So it's operating as a kind of I call it an interstitial organization. So an organization operating across multiple institutional domains, combining diplomacy, defense, intelligence, development aid, and trade support. So from these different areas, you would have, of course, experts that operate and are trained in different types of expertise, and they combine these and provide actually comprehensive solutions to European presence and to support European interests, EU interests outside of the European Union. So that's very exciting as a model of an integrated foreign service. And a number of governments have been experimenting with whole of government approach to organizing diplomatic services, integrating and amalgamating, development aid with diplomacy, or in some cases, like in a French case, they try to integrate defense, some defense elements into the foreign ministry and so on. But I mean, there is no foreign service that actually has done it in this way, in the same way, to the same extent as the European Union's External Action Service. So I think it's actually a pretty exciting model, and it can complement. What's interesting about it is that it can complement the foreign services and diplomatic presence by the member states of the European Union, because of course Germany, France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Austria, Poland, all of them have foreign services, and they're all present in countries, and they have their own interests, and they operate. So, in fact, if you can think of this as, you can think of the EAS, the External Action Service of the European Union, as a kind of a hub, a coordination hub of different networks of foreign services, different diplomatic services. A pretty exciting model of how you can actually organize diplomatic presence with the fact that the EAS can do things that the member states cannot do, which is promoting democracy, promoting civil society, promoting various kinds of economic cooperation and transformation processes inside societies from a kind of a normative liberal democratic point of view. And that's kind of exciting too. So coming back to your question, are they effective in today's world? Now, there has been an interesting process of change happening in the External Action Service in response to, in particular, Russia's increased pressure against the liberal international order. It's following its attack on Ukraine in 2014, and then later on also, of course, the full-scale conventional war in 2022. And so we had seen an organizational changes in the External Action Service that point in the direction of them taking on a much more clearly geopolitical role. So that has to do, for instance, with them, standardizing and and developing and professionalizing the security vetting procedures for staff. There's much more professional processes in place now in terms of security vetting of the diplomatic staff. You also have resources such as armored vehicles that are being bought by embassies of the European Union, by the delegations of the European Union that are it's secure rooms that are developed So various kinds of technical aspects are also in place. Plus, they have something they call the geopolitical matrix, in which every delegation is asked to define their role and their work in geopolitical terms. So there has been arguably a doctrinal shift in the EAS towards more geopolitical thinking, actually from like 2020, 2021. So we have had these adaptations that have been going on, but at the same time, to come back to the original design or the idea, it is interesting as a kind of a hub connecting the EAS, as a hub connecting the resources of the member states' diplomatic services.
Okay, very interesting. EU has the so-called delegations in many foreign countries. It's a kind of embassy, maybe not exactly embassy as you mentioned, but it's a diplomatic mission. So, but at the same time, member countries have their own embassies. So do you see any kinds of competition between them? How do they coordinate their activities? So,
well, it depends on, of course, where you are, because there are different patterns of diplomatic presence. So there are some capitals around the world, like let's say Beijing, Moscow, Tokyo, where you have all the member states present with their own embassies. Plus, of course, then you have the delegation of the European Union. So in these cases, you often find yourself, in a very dense European diplomatic community. Now, in every one of these capitals, you would have coordination meetings of European diplomats on a weekly basis, or even sometimes more than that, depending on, of course, issues that are being discussed in this particular place. So there is coordination going on. Now, the European Union's delegations, according to the treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, they are, to coordinate the diplomatic presence of the member states around the world. But they don't have, for instance, a consular role. Not the same kind of consular role as embassies usually have, right? So in terms of passports and all kinds of other consular functions, I mean, they cannot really perform the consular functions. But they do have a role in coordinating. At the same time, when you then think about these differentiated patterns of diplomatic presence, so in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in a number of countries there, or in some Latin American countries, you would have very few member states embassies, right? So also in some of the nations of the Pacific and so on, you would sometimes have only one embassy of the member states. So in these cases, often member states of the European Union do rely on the EU's delegation to provide access, to provide information, to support them when there are visits by politicians or by business people and so on. So it really depends on the density of diplomatic presence of the member states as to what role the EU's delegation actually plays out in the third countries. And in some cases, actually, for instance, like France in Algeria, they would have there are hundreds of people working for the French embassy in Algiers. And there are only dozens working for the EU's delegation in Algiers. So the reality is, of course, France actually is much more present, way more heavily present in Algiers, in Algeria than the European Union. So in this case, the weight is reversed, where the member states actually do not need the EU's analytical inputs or other aspects all that much as they do in other places. There are some member states who have larger diplomatic networks than the European Union. The European Union has about 140 delegations around the world. Like France has about 200, more than 200 actually, diplomatic missions. Germany is close to that number, and so in these cases, there's not much of a need of the EU's diplomatic presence. But also in these cases, even for these major European powers like France and Germany, still the European Union's delegation and the EU's approach to diplomacy is sometimes beneficial to have because they do not have the colonial legacies. Especially in the case of France, that might constitute the problem in some places around Africa, but also in other places. So in these cases, the European Union's delegation is actually seen as somewhat of a much more viable option for for interlocutors and for those it negotiates with. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Again, it seems to me in terms of image, embassies are much more visible, much more, they have more high-profile ambassadors. I mean, European, some ambassadors. But in terms of delegations, I don't know, maybe I'm mistaken, because they have usually, it's a lower profile in public visibility. Maybe it will change, I don't know.
Well, this is one of those status issues that the European Union has had to struggle with, which is the status of the delegations and actually the status of the diplomats of the European Union. Who are they? Who do they really represent? Now, since since like the 1970s, it was actually Japan who started to see the European communities back then delegation as an embassy, and they actually awarded it all the immunities and all the status, the same status as embassies. So it started there, but then, of course, around the world, the European Union's diplomats were instructed in the 1980s to actually ask the host countries to treat them as if they were representing a state and award them with the same immunities, with the same status. It's not irreversible. We have seen, of course, a pattern where this has been normal and normalized, and countries do award the European Union delegations the same status as to embassies of states. But we have seen reversals of these kinds of situations, of this status. For instance, in London, they have, under the Boris Johnson government, they have simply decided to downgrade the European Union's delegation from the same status as states towards just a regular international organization. And they argued that in fact there are about 40 international organizations present in London, and so if they would award the EU with something else, with something more, then they would have to also start awarding the EU, the other international organizations with the same status. And so in this case, they decided to downgrade the EU. Same thing happened in DC, Washington, DC, by the way, under the previous Trump administration. They haven't gone down that road yet this time. So let's see whether that comes anytime soon. But the EU's diplomatic status has been subject to all kinds of pressures and all kinds of questioning. So it has had to struggle in its attempts to establish its diplomatic status. What's interesting also is that it has had to struggle in establishing its diplomatic status not only in relation to the outside, to the third countries, but in fact in relation to the member states itself. Because they have been involved in status struggles with the European Union itself. Our good colleague Rebecca Adler-Nissen has done work on this, where she actually looked at the status struggles between the EU and the member states' diplomatic services. Because for them, obviously, for the member states, when the EU and if the EU is getting diplomatic status as an actor representing the European Union, then of course, automatically almost, the member states are losing such a status, or are at least perceiving the possibility of losing such a status. So this raises very fundamental questions about sovereignty as such.
Can you please say a few words about internal politics of appointment of head of delegations, or just working in European external diplomatic service? So are there any tensions between countries? So who could take this head of delegation position, quotas or some other issues?
Yeah. So of course there are struggles, as always, as in any kind of an organization, and especially these the posts of the heads of delegations are obviously very sought after. So obviously this is there are all kinds of pressures and struggles in the organization. Now there are some, some of the Central and Eastern European countries, they have felt that they have not been all that represented on the level of heads of delegations. And that is a fact. I mean, that is, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, and so on, haven't really had all that many heads of delegations in the European External Action Service so far. Now, one of the reasons why, I mean, of course, the situation has been improving over the years, but it's not ideal yet. And one of the reasons why this is the case, however, there are practical reasons for it, because very often the EU delegations often have staff, the number of staff, which is way higher than a lot of these smaller countries have in their own embassies. And so the experience of people, applying for jobs in the External Action Service for these, top level diplomatic jobs like ambassadorial level jobs, they don't have experience with managing large staffs, right? Large posts, so for practical reasons, that's one of the limitations. Another limitation is that French language is very much spoken throughout the External Action Service. Of course, it's English, absolutely. I mean, English works as the lingua franca. Everyone, uses that. But then French is actually the second one, which everyone has to speak on a very high level or a working level. And so again, diplomats from a number of countries just don't have the knowledge of French, and so that is an impediment in how they can succeed in the job interviews. But I mean, this is a very competitive process and just a normal, competition for positions where people apply and they do get posts. Now we do have some really excellent some really excellent heads of delegations who have also some regional and special expertise. So if you think, for instance, about the current EU ambassador to Ukraine, Katarina Maternova, she's a high-profile, commission official. She used to work for the European Commission. She hasn't really worked in the External Action Service, but she worked for the European Commission as one of the highest, as Director General, or actually Deputy Director General in the DG NIR, which is Directorate General for Enlargement. So she has had a very specific regional expertise on Eastern Europe. She has coordinated Eastern European engagement of the European Union, all the processes of societal transformation support and so on in the region of Eastern Europe. And then she became the ambassador to Ukraine this is about 2 years ago. She's Slovak originally, and so also she has a background that helps her understand the societal transformation and democratic transformation processes. So in this case, we see an example of how and she's also female. So that's also one of the issues where we didn't really see parity in terms of presence of female diplomats in the External Action Service on the ambassadorial level, and that again also is. But I mean, Katarina Maternova shows us that it's possible, that it's done, and that also these underrepresented groups, females, Central and Eastern Europeans, can actually make a major impact. And yeah.
Okay. All right. What can we say about the lobbying in the European Union regarding its foreign policy? Is it possible to be official lobbyist? So what kinds of practices do they have in the EU lobbying practice?
Yeah, well, there is indeed a lot of lobbying going on in Brussels, in the European Commission, but also in various other institutions. Now, one of those things that are specific about Brussels, about the Brussels context, is that there are not many lobbying rules. So, it's far from that regulated as it is in the United States. In the United States, you have all kinds of regulations, and there are registered lobbying firms and politicians, members of Congress, members of various federal departments do meet with lobbyists, but it's a normal part of life, normal part of political life. It's normal part of political life also in Brussels, but it's not regulated. And of course, this is one of those things that make it a very challenging. There isn't much of an overview as to how this happens and who does what and so on. And so I think this should be much more regulated than it is at the moment. But so yes, if you're asking about lobbying, absolutely. It's happening. On what level, how, who does it? I can't tell you that. I haven't really done enough research on this. But it is likely that it really is happening in a major way. I think the EU in general, I mean, of course, it's the European Commission, but also everyone, all the other institutions are very careful about lobbying. They are being, there are, of course, very strict administrative procedures. There's administrative accountability. They have to report on meetings. That is true, but it's not all that regulated and not all that transparent as it is. So this is one of the aspects of Brussels governance or operations of the Brussels institutions that would have to be improved significantly. Absolutely.
All right. So how about the military-industrial complex, its role in the EU politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's there are multiple frameworks and various frameworks how that works, and it's been working since the 1950s in various formats. And there were a number of coordination platforms, institutional coordination platforms for defense coordination. There was something called the Western European Union, which is now abolished, doesn't work anymore. But you do have the European Defense Agency, more recently founded in 2004. That's there to coordinate and create a more integrated defense market in the European Union, to create synergies across national defense markets, because this is one of those things one of the areas that have been actually excluded from the European Union's single market and from integration of market resources has been defense. This is systematically excluded, and so every member state has its own defense industry, as it were, and its own rules, as well as its own standards. And that creates a lot of redundancy, because of course, if you have 150 different weapon systems in Europe, 17 different types of battle tanks, main battle tanks, you only have one in the United States. European Union and its member states have 17 different types of battle tanks, right? There you have, of course, multiple, investment processes going on into research and development, a lot of redundancy, and there is space for, creating synergies across national borders inside the European Union in defense. There are, as I said earlier before, and there is the new commissioner for defense and space. And that role is now going to be exactly in coordinating the defense industries and the defense industrial production. We have seen the European Union, for instance, now promise Ukraine to deliver million rounds of artillery rounds, 155 millimeter caliber artillery rounds in 2023. That didn't happen, because the production processes were not activated, and of course they tried to get some. They did deliver some, but certainly not a million. So again, this is one of those things that really the EU has to get its act together in terms of actually coordinating across borders, and there are multiple initiatives right now that are trying to do that. Yeah.
Right, but can we say that this military-industrial complex, it is a powerful player in European politics, foreign policy, or not?
Well, it's a powerful player in I would say in the national
decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful player in the national decision making, I would say, because still a lot of the defense industries are still nationally organized primarily. So in the case of France has a major defense industry, as has Germany. But of course, the German industry is way smaller than the French one. But also, in fact, the British defense industry, that we shouldn't forget, they are part of the UK has left the EU in the Brexit process, but in defense and defense industries, they continue to be members of an organization called OCCAR, which is an organization, organization that is an international organization attached to the EU, working with the EU, but not exactly part of the EU, and they are coordinating defense production, and there the UK is on board. So in many respects, when we think about the defense industrial complex in the EU and defense production in the EU, we need to think about the UK as part of this. And they are very much involved in defense industry. Yeah.
Right. So I know that you are doing some research on private military and security companies. So can you say a few words about these kinds of private military and security companies in the EU, their role and perspective for future growth?
Yes, indeed. I mean, of course, privatization of warfare and the use of private military and security companies, this has been a theme or an issue in policymaking, especially in the last 30 years or so, since the end of the Cold War. There has been a booming industry on a global scale of private military and security companies. Now, of course, these are not just companies offering lethal combat services, but they are also, in military logistics, in transport, catering, building military bases, cybersecurity, flying drones. I mean, there are multiple areas in which the private military and security companies operate and offer services to defense establishments. So this has been studied in the United States and in the UK quite a lot, quite extensively. And then there are, also developments because they've been pioneers in these areas. It has been studied a little less in the case of the European Union, but that doesn't mean the European Union doesn't use private military and security companies. In fact, it does. We have recently, with a colleague of mine, with Kamila Koníková, we have written an analysis and developed a database of the private military and security companies in the European Union or linked to the European Union between the years 2013 and 2023. This is now going to be published soon in Journal of Common Market Studies later this year. And so what that shows, there are actually hundreds. We have in our database currently 564 such private military and security companies that operate out of the member states of the European Union, or in fact, some of them are based outside the EU, but they have contracts with the EU and its member states' governments in defense. What's interesting is that the European Union, if we're talking about the EU as such, they have changed rules and they have introduced new guidelines for the planning of the so-called crisis management missions, both civilian and military. And this is in 2014. And so since 2014, the European Union in the planning process for any kind of crisis management mission, they now automatically have to include the identification of those services that will be contracted out to private military and security contractors. And so in this case, so we have a more of a systematic approach now to using private military contractors. And the private industry, defense industry, private military industry, has been very actively providing these services. It goes all the way from guarding the premises of EU delegations to guarding the convoys, military convoys, and transport, to demining or cyber security, also analysis, diplomatic and intelligence. So it's various kinds of services that the EU keeps on buying from the private sector. And so the argument that we make is that the European Union, to use Anna Leander's famous phrase, is an enmeshed military and security actor, enmeshed defense actor, enmeshed in the sense of using both state capacities as well as market-based capacities. And you cannot really always tell the difference, especially in these operations of crisis management of the European Union. So it's very interesting to study. It's a very early stage in also analyzing these companies, and I think we need to. There's much more work to be done.
Well, perhaps it's no doubt it's a very much developing, growing area industry now. Perhaps in a few years it would be even much bigger.
Absolutely. If you look at statistics, it is very clear, and also because of the current volatile situations in various parts of the world, this industry is, one would say, unfortunately growing and growing in a major way. Yeah.
Okay. So on organizational theory, you are expert in this field. how can organizational theory contribute to a better understanding of diplomacy, diplomatic activities, diplomatic institutions, particularly in European Union?
Mhm. Well, very often when you analyze international relations and, for instance, the role of diplomacy in international relations, you often end up talking about great power politics, or you talk about how diplomacy is used as an instrument in the hands of great powers or smaller states or whatever else. But when we think about diplomacy, and you know it very well, Alisher, since you've been working on this for a long time, but when we look at diplomacy, it's actually an institution. It's an institutionalized system in which we have, it's highly regulated. There are many rules and norms, both written and unwritten, that are followed. And this is not just in the current era, but it's also in the era, earlier eras. So whenever we would look at, the development of global orders, it's actually very useful to study diplomacy and diplomatic interactions, because then you can actually, through that, read the nature, interpret the nature of a given interaction order or an international order, or an interaction order, I would say, is more useful as a phrase, because then we didn't have nations all the time in history. So we would have a diplomatic order that, and thereby you can analyze it. So coming back to your question, I think it's very useful to actually study diplomacy as an institutionalized area, use organization theory, and there are very, very good, theoretical tools to explain stability and change of institutions and of organizations. And thereby you can apply it very well to to the foreign ministries as the organizational mainstay in which the institution of diplomacy is embedded. It's great to use organization theory on diplomatic establishments, because that helps you explain change and stability of these establishments in a very useful way, I found. Plus, it explains also, or helps you. Organization theory is very useful in studying innovation, emergence of new organizational forms, how older forms give way to new organizational forms, how an older order can coexist with a new organized or institutionalized order. And that's very much applicable to the study of new forms of diplomatic organization, or in fact, old diplomatic orders coexisting with new ones, and so on. So I found a lot of work in international relations that's really exciting actually uses organization theory as the background, whether they actually acknowledge it or not, implicitly or explicitly, but in fact they do often do that. A lot of exciting work is actually going down that road. So think about Hendrik Spruit's analysis of the formation of the modern state order. And that very much uses, population ecology arguments from organization theory, which is about Darwinian selection processes. And he explains how the state has won out against other forms, but it's actually using this organization theory. Or John Ruggie's work on territoriality as a key element in the modern state order, very much also is looking at the structuring of this order. And I tend to use, March and Olson's approach to institutions as sets of rules and routines that regulate relations between actors in terms of their roles and notions of appropriate actions in given situations. And so that's very useful. Or you can actually use, the notion of organizational field, which I've been using a lot. This has been used for various other contexts, but you can actually apply it very well to diplomacy and the context of foreign ministries as an organizational field, because there you see, pressures towards adaptation, which would be leading to homogeneity, and so on. And that, it actually is very useful to think about it. Plus, it explains why it's so difficult to get rid of foreign ministries. It explains the stability. It explains the stability of foreign ministries as a model that actually has been developed in a different era. I mean, this is a model from the 17th, 18th century, and yet we still have it and it still operates. But that has to do with path dependency, institutional path dependency, and stickiness of institutions that are there. So it's actually quite striking that new states that are founded in the 21st century continue to establish an institutional structure from the 17th century, right? I mean, it's very strange, but it's, if you think of it, but and it shouldn't happen, but it does happen, and you can explain it very well if you use these institutional and organizational approaches to studying diplomacy.
You know, in this context, do you also consider organizational behavior, organizational psychology, organizational development, all these little bit other fields? Are they important for you?
Well, I haven't really. I mean, I hear what you're asking. It's psychology and so on. I haven't really done much of a work in this area, although I absolutely see that this could be very applicable, and colleagues do work with these approaches, especially when they study negotiations, but also when they study socialization of diplomatic staff and interactions in missions. There are various ways how this can be done. You can, of course, also study such processes or practices as speech writing. I mean, there is, of course, this very famous work by Ivar Neumann, our good colleague, who has done studied speech writing in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry in this case, and that also tells you a lot about organizational practices that maintain a certain order in place. Vincent Pouliot, another good colleague, has also studied practices. So in diplomatic establishments and international organizations such as NATO. So I mean, there are various ways of how you can, of course, apply these insights from organization theory or, in fact, organizational sociology to diplomacy. After all, international relations is social science, and so. We're very well served with using theoretical approaches from organization theory and institutional theory.
So I have, if you don't mind, two more questions.
Sure.
First, if I would ask you, please, Professor Bátora, name 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses of the European Union as a diplomatic actor, or European Union's diplomacy. So what would be 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses?
Okay, well, let me try. So if we were to talk about 3 strengths, the strengths are that strength number 1 would be that you can do things that states cannot do. That is, get involved in the support of societal transformation processes. Strength number 2, you can avoid nationalism in your diplomatic approach. Because, of course, by the nature of it, the EU is not a nation, it's not a state, it always has to negotiate. It always has to negotiate its positions, and so it works in a kind of a pragmatic actor that helps others and supports others, and of course it promotes its own interests, but in a kind of a non-nationalist way. And maybe the 3rd strength of EU diplomacy would be that it doesn't clearly define where the borders are. So it's easier for the EU to actually have to include others in its own orbit. And the management of this inclusion in the orbit, that's actually the job of the EU's diplomacy, not of the national diplomacies. It's actually the job of the EU level diplomacy. So these 3. Now let me think about the weaknesses. So I would say the weakness of EU diplomacy in this case would be that it sometimes operates more like an advanced travel agency rather than a diplomatic service. So it can only do what the member states allow it to do, right? And so so it's a systemic weakness. So that I think is a weakness. Another one would be, what would be the next one? Well, it's really hard for the EU to play the old diplomatic game. So when you think about the established game, when major powers get involved in bilateral diplomacy, you are probably familiar with the Sofa Gate, when Erdogan had invited President Erdogan of Turkey had invited the EU for a bilateral meeting, and there we had the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the president of the Council, and they didn't know who should sit down. There was only one seat available, right? And it gets this actually shows you the structural incompatibility of the EU with this old diplomatic game. Well, and then the third one, you're pushing me to put forward three. So a third one would be, if the EU is really a promoter of liberal democratic values and its own in the world, it should actually be good in building up the External Action Service in ways that reflect that. So that there should be more parity of female representation, as well as somehow more parity of all the member states on the ambassadorial level. Again, there are practical reasons for why that's not the case, especially in terms of the representation of the Central and Eastern European countries, because often their diplomats don't have just enough experience. But it is still a challenge because, of course, if you're promoting a set of values, you need to be able to live by them.
In fact, it is very difficult to talk about European diplomacy because things are so much mixed that it's very difficult to distinguish internal topics, external topics. So it's quite a difficult subject. All right. So my last question. I know you are a very prominent scholar. You enjoy your work. You are enjoying talking to students, doing research. But imagine that you would be offered a job of a head of the European External Action Service. Well, now you said, okay, I'll take it for a few days, maybe or for a few months or a few years. What would be your first action, first decision?
Wow, now you're surprising me with this question. Well, first of all, I'm probably not going to be offered that job. So,
well, anyway,
so you're giving me the opportunity to think about
why
something.
I'm asking this. Let me explain why I'm asking you. I often see that the scholars are very much within scholarship. Practitioners are quite far from them. So. But from time to time, it is, I believe it's a nice practice to imagine that you are doing some practical work for scholars and for practitioners engaging in some theoretical discourses. It is, I believe it's a useful practice. So just imagination. You are a very big diplomat in you, number one. What would be your first decision?
I think we would probably do some kind of a dinner with the colleagues, with the senior colleagues from the ministry, and also with the heads of state once they would be in Brussels, and we would talk and get to know each other relatively well. So kind of a socializing event would be very helpful. Because when, of course, these things are happening indeed, and there are various formats in which they are happening. But I think for the External Action Service, it would be helpful for all the senior folks in the service to actually get to know who they're working with and who they are when they are trying to coordinate external relations. So I would do this during the FAC meeting, Foreign Affairs Council meeting, when you have the foreign ministers in town. I would organize a serious socializing weekend, let's call it that.
Well, you're a very good diplomat. In fact, that's a very essential part of diplomatic practice. When we eat with someone, when we drink with someone, we create quite a different relationship. We never eat with our enemies. We never drink with our enemies. So it is a part of building relationship. It's a part of diplomacy. So you did a very good diplomatic job.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Bátora, thank you so much. I very much enjoyed our talks. You have so many knowledge of European issues. It's great to learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faizullaev. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.